can you cast your mind back to the first time you stayed at a Landmark Trust property? Do you remember which one it was? And what was it like?
We arrived at this medieval hall, and I remember there was a huge, great big, hoary old oak door, and the door squeaked open, and we came into this extraordinary bit of the Middle Ages, really, and the light falling through the great big Gothic windows, and a huge old stove at the end called a gurney, which is the sort of stove they used in the 19th century cathedrals. Fill it with logs and it gives out a very small amount of heat. It was a magical moment for me in discovering that this whole hidden world existed of these extraordinary places, and that they could be yours, and that they had a simplicity to them. It was sort of a great noble building, but without being pompous, and it wasn't filled with sort of banqueting furniture, and it had a simplicity to it that made it feel like we had just stumbled on it and never looked back.
The Landmark Trust is a charity started back in 1965 by husband and wife John and Christian Smith. The idea was simple: to rescue historic buildings, like the medieval manor Anna was just describing, all around the UK. Rescue from what, you ask? Mainly from falling into ruins or sometimes being demolished. They did that by looking for properties in need and then repairing, restoring and repurposing them, giving them a new lease of life as unique holiday homes. To this day, the Trust's growing portfolio of properties is available for rent by the public at affordable prices and, depending on the season, much cheaper than your average hotel. And the income from the stays, in turn, helps with the upkeep of the properties.
And we're still at it. And we've, in that time, since John and Christian Smith established it, we've rescued over 200 historic buildings. And they go from strength to strength as places that people want to come and stay, and that generates the income that allows us to take on the next building.
Although the Landmark Trust has been around for almost half a century, the work it does to protect and restore historic buildings couldn't be more relevant today. Recent studies found that a whopping 50,000 buildings are demolished every year in the United Kingdom to meet the growing demands of our modern life and housing. What's more, globally, in terms of construction, we're on track to build a city the size of New York every month for the next 40 years. So, wouldn't it make sense to consider how we can reuse existing buildings before we demolish and unnecessarily build anew? And can't we accommodate the modern world's changing needs while still honouring the past? Of course, in reality, things are a little more complicated. In this episode, we're looking at why and how we should be reusing our architectural heritage, not only to preserve the treasures of the past, but to build a more sustainable future. We're heading to Japan, Chile, and the UK to hear from the architects, archaeologists, and all-round heritage lovers who are transforming rundown buildings and giving them a new purpose. Stay with us. This is a podcast by Toposophy. For more than a decade, Toposophy has been inspiring and informing its clients on how to transform places, whether they're neighborhoods, cities, regions, or whole countries. The Toposophy team works with international organizations, multinational brands, and government agencies around the world, leading them every step of the way to find placemaking and marketing solutions that are built to last. As constantly curious people, the team loves to collect game-changing ideas that are transforming other sectors and draw valuable lessons for the future of places. This podcast series, curated by the Toposophy team, is just one example of how these valuable ideas are brought to life. First up, we're in Kyoto to take a look at the lessons we can learn from the city and how they're protecting a prized piece of architectural heritage that until recently was under threat, the Machiya townhouses. Here's journalist Kenji Hall in Japan with this special report for us.
Machiya literally means townhouse. Back in the day, they were living quarters and merchant shops and artisanal workshops. Some are decades old and some are centuries old. They're these picturesque wooden buildings with heavy ceramic roof tiles and the weather-aged facades of darkened wooden planks. In Kyoto, they're also known as unagi no nedoko. This means the den of an eel, and you can imagine what that looks like. It's a long space with an opening at the narrow end. So most machiya have narrow facades, but their interiors extend quite a way back from the street. So much of the building is actually hidden from view because of this. Yes, you do have modern buildings in the city center. Yes, you do have high-rise buildings, but you also have these gorgeous 1, 2, and 3-story low-rise, old wooden traditional buildings that really contribute to the charm and the ambiance of Kyoto. Kyoto is one of the few cities in Japan that has a huge number of these historic buildings. There are roughly 40,000 kyomachiya left. About half of those, about 20,000 of them, are actually in the city center. Preserving them is costly, and not upgrading them enough can make them essentially inhospitable. I think the biggest problem was that Kyoto city officials didn't realize what a cultural asset they had in their hands. They didn't know how to go about saving these buildings. And to be honest with you, there weren't the statistics available to them to understand how quickly these buildings were disappearing. Once they saw the numbers of buildings that were being torn down, once they realized that there wasn't the funding for these people who owned the buildings to restore them or to save them or to reuse them, that's when essentially the officials jumped into action. 2 decades ago, Kyoto City Hall began to get really serious about preserving these buildings. But before that, it was mainly community groups and private citizens who were pushing for the preservation of these buildings. Tourism accounts for about 10% of Kyoto's overall economy. The problem is the number of visitors is just a huge burden on the city. In 2019, 53.5 million people visited Kyoto, and that includes roughly 9 million foreign visitors. The media was saying that Kyoto had been ruined by kanko kogai, which translates to tourism pollution, and is essentially over-tourism. It was the foot traffic, the noise, the long queues, just the fact that residents weren't able to go about their business because there were so many tourists. And at the same time, that attention, that recognition is what made Kyoto even more conscious of its urban architectural heritage. Yes, the tourists were a huge burden on the city, but having that much tourism and having all that money flowing into the city essentially helped the preservationist movement grow. With the city behind it now, what you're seeing is you're seeing a connection between the sellers who want to get rid of these properties, the buyers who want to turn these properties into something else, or a home for somebody, or someplace for a business owner to open a shop. A lot of these machiya have been renovated for Airbnb-style accommodations. Some have been refurbished and transformed into traditional ryokan inns. Some are shops, high-end restaurants. Some are shared offices, and in some cases, shared living quarters. I have stayed in some amazing ryokan that were converted from machiya. One was called Shikijuraku, and it had 10 spacious guest rooms, each one unique and furnished with vintage furniture and lamps and ceramic tubs. They were built mostly by craftsmen. These are extremely skilled artisans who worked on very specific parts of the buildings. If Japan lets them disappear, the skills that are needed to build and to preserve and to restore these buildings will also disappear. So when you're preserving the traditional crafts, what you're essentially doing is you're saving the people who are not only building the building, you're also saving the people who are putting the clay on the walls. You're preserving the work of people who weave the tatami mats. You're preserving the work of the people who make the heavy ceramic tiles that go on the rooftops. There's so many different aspects of these buildings that involve artisans. Often it's usually a balance in preserving these buildings between how much of the historical features of the house do you keep and how much do you change so that it's comfortable and cozy enough to live in, to work in, to use on a daily basis in a modern society. I am very, very encouraged by what I've seen. I've seen more young people getting involved in the preservation of these buildings. In fact, when you're in Kyoto, you can't avoid them. And that's what makes the place so charming. It's just this beautiful, beautiful low-rise city that you can't recreate. It's a case of if Kyoto can figure out how to save its Machiya, then maybe that example can help other cities figure out how to save theirs.
Thanks to Kenji Hall in Japan. Now, looking at the example of the Machiya through Toposophy's strategic lens, we can see that it offers a lot of valuable insights, from how tourism can go hand in hand with restoration, one often helping the other, to the critical role grassroots organizations can play in influencing policy, and how one of the indirect benefits of preserving heritage lies in the safeguarding of traditional crafts. But as we heard at the beginning of the show, it isn't just Japan that's paving the way in the adaptive reuse of heritage. Let's head back to the UK and the Landmark Trust. One of their biggest challenges when it comes to restoration? Crafting a unique approach depending on the property.
Here on the first floor, the priest, this is the area where the priest actually lived. So he had a sitting room, bedroom and closet. And we're going to keep this as the Landmark Trust sitting room. It's got a big oriel window, which Edward Pugin added a little bit later, which gives you a wonderful view of the monastery.
Everything really starts with the specificity, the particularity of that building.
We're back with Anna Keay.
We take a building like the Semaphore Tower, a very particular type of building that was part of a chain of structures between London and Portsmouth, which we used for signalling in the age before you had electric telegraph or phones or anything.
The tower, built in the 1820s, sits in the middle of a nature reserve in Surrey and is the last of its kind left in the UK. In 2018, the Landmark Trust rescued the 5-storey building and converted it into a holiday home, fully equipped with military features like a telescope on the roof terrace and flags in the bathroom.
So there is a kind of style, an aesthetic, a palette of colours and so on, which one might associate with that time. But it's also not a building that was a kind of polite building. It was a utilitarian building. It was a building about performing kind of military function. So in terms of the sort of tone of the way you do it, we didn't want it to be full of highly decorated bits of mahogany furniture. We wanted it to have a sense of sturdy, handsome, practical qualities about it.
And that's just one of over 200 Landmark Trust properties. From quaint chapels in remote Snowdonia to stately Georgian houses in Surrey, their portfolio boasts castles, forts, old schools, hospitals, manors, and many more.
People come to stay in our buildings. They find the idea magical, romantic. They're drawn to them. They want to know about them.
So when thinking about how to curate these buildings, the Trust really focuses on this idea of the past and keeping those stories alive. I've had my fair share of weekends away in the countryside with the Landmark Trust too. My first time was staying at Tea Capel in Wales. It's a former chapel, as you might have guessed from the name, in an old mining settlement and with a stream passing right next to it. While I was there, I couldn't help but feel as though I drifted back in time, imagining the lives of the families who'd lived in the village, while of course trying to distract myself from the eeriness that comes from staying in an old church.
Well, you want to know what sort of people worked here and what were their lives like and who were they? Were there families here or was it just individuals? What was this existence about? We also try to make sure that the bookshelves in each of our buildings, that everything that's on them has been specifically chosen to enable you to take a kind of imaginative journey around and through that place.
Think folk tales, classic novels and poetry from the area. Then there's travel diaries, history books on the region's traditions, and even records of old maps. But the Landmark Trust isn't only about the romantic idea of keeping old stories and tales alive, it also protects valuable practical know-how. Like the Machiya in Japan, the traditional building methods and crafts that go into restoring the Trust's buildings are kept alive too. The Trust works with makers and artisans from around the UK, from expert weavers to traditional stonemasons and decorative plasterers.
I mean, the level of craftsmanship needed to bring this back is incredible, really, because you've got to form all the beautiful timber work. You can see where the old timbers, the curved timbers, have been set before. Yeah. All that will have to be replaced.
That's George Clark, a Landmark Trust ambassador. He and Anna are taking a closer look at one of the properties, an 18th century dairy in Kent.
Then it's going to be covered again, plastered, and then all of these tiny plaster details brought back in as well. It's a really intensive job, isn't it?
It is, and it's going to be made all the more so by the fact that we want to hang on to as much as we possibly can of this original stuff.
The plasterers that worked on the building, the Geishas family, specialise in decorative plastering, a delicate and dexterous trade that turns ceilings and walls into pieces of art. Their work's even taken them to Downing Street and Windsor Castle. And yes, some of these crafts might carry higher price tags than more simple building techniques, but you're preserving the cultural identity and history of a place, as well as passing down skills to the new generation.
It's a lovely thing because each one of these projects is a unique cocktail of people reflecting the expertise and the skills and the experience that you need to have to achieve the best possible result for that particular building.
So people are key, and this cocktail of people that Anna describes keeps growing, and not just for the Trust. Over the past decade, the number of people employed by heritage projects rose by 24% in the UK. In fact, the business of repairing, reusing and retrofitting is more labour-intensive than constructing new buildings, meaning that restoration actually creates more jobs. Among the people involved in making it happen for the Trust are its network of architects, local builders and craftsmen, the people who leave their homes to the Trust, more on that later, and also, crucially, a loyal community of volunteers, a mix of budding building enthusiasts, history buffs and locals. Volunteers are often drafted in during the restoration process to help with basic construction jobs, many of them never having worked on a construction site before.
As a volunteer, basically, I love old buildings. I holiday in Landmark Trust properties, so it just felt like a bit of giving back.
The tasks can range from cleaning to painting, sanding, or even furniture making. There's even an opportunity for these volunteers to learn from blacksmiths, stonemasons, and other specialists working on the properties. When the project's complete, volunteers take on the role of housekeepers, gardeners, and even tour guides at the properties. Every year, the Landmark Trust is made aware of around 100 buildings at risk. Out of these, they might take on only one or two, prioritising the most culturally or architecturally significant and most in need. Then, the Trust considers how much the restoration will cost and whether they could raise these funds.
What we don't do is go and buy things on the market that we think look interesting, because if the market forces will save a building, then there's no place for a charity.
A little earlier, we mentioned that the Trust receives a number of its properties from donations, especially in cases when the owners don't have the means to maintain or look after them on their own. In essence, the Trust never borrows or takes out loans to purchase them. Then it's on to the restoration. And despite the fact that so many historic buildings are in need of some TLC, they often struggle to gain the attention of governments. But the Trust seems to have found a model that works. It sources the funds it needs for each restoration by relying on a mix of grants from heritage trusts, legacy funds, small donations, and large-scale public campaigns. One of their latest projects is Fairburn Tower in Inverness, costing a cool £2 million to restore. They did it with a sizable grant from the Scottish Heritage Agency and over 1,200 donations during a 2-year fundraising period.
We're in quite an unusual position because we have a community of supporters and enthusiasts out there in their tens of thousands whose generosity and belief in what we do is a really important part of our fundraising. It is true that a mixture of, as it were, public funds from the government or sources like the lottery, if you can bring those together with grassroots individual donations, then that's a good cocktail. And I think people's enthusiasm for rescuing historic buildings is, in my experience, tremendous. And nobody on the whole feels it stronger than the people who live in that place.
Visitors to the Landmark Trust come from far and wide, and it's down to the feeling that you're visiting a home. And old though these buildings may be, ensuring comfort to create the best possible experience isn't something the Trust takes lightly.
You've got to make it be somewhere that you're going to have a nice time. So it can't be, everything has to stand use. The chairs have to be comfortable. So there's a kind of marriage, I suppose, of the kind of historical atmosphere and particularity of the place and the sort of simple characteristics of somewhere where you're going to have a lovely time. If you can, you need to be able to light a fire, that sort of thing.
Simply showing some love for neglected and endangered buildings can create unique visitor experiences that can trump even the flashiest new hotel in town. And it's a model that's been used further afield too, with completely different buildings. In the sparsely populated slopes of the Chilean Andes, on the border between Bolivia and Peru, one project is restoring disused houses and even derelict temples, making them part of a heritage hiking route that's attracting thousands to the area. It's become an inspiration for a whole region to reuse their historical buildings in imaginative ways.
The Fundación Altiplano. This is a foundation who is specializing on the conservation and the adaptive reuse of historic buildings, especially in rural areas. They have been doing...
That's Kalliopi Fouseki, a maestro in all things heritage, especially buildings. She runs the UCL course in Sustainable Heritage Management and has conducted research around the world into the effects and benefits of adaptively reusing buildings.
In the area of Arica y Parinacota, it's a very deprived area, and because of that, over the years, the area has been abandoned. So there's like a group of 100 villages which are really severely abandoned. So what the foundation did, they tried to start working with the local communities and the local authority to work together on the conservation of the old villages, of the old buildings, and try to adaptively reuse them for new businesses which were linked with the idea of ecotourism. A lot of people became kind of entrepreneurs, young people, who instigated an ecotouristic related business as part of that project.
Ecotourism is simply tourism that's sustainable for both the community of a place as well as the land, and is intrinsically linked to nature. The hiking trail Ruta de la Misiones Sarana offers tourists a path that takes them through these villages to visit the traditional restored churches and temples while experiencing the natural beauty of the Andes Mountains.
There was a few churches, obviously. There were also buildings like houses inhabited in the past. It's not like these monumental buildings that we see from stone or more robust materials. So you would have a lot of adobe materials and...
Not the Photoshop software. Adobe is Spanish for mud brick, and is basically just a combination of dirt and other organic materials like straw or dung. It's especially durable in drier parts of the world, and has been used in the Americas and beyond for thousands of years. Sure, less grand than some of the stately homes of the Landmark Trust, but the temples and houses are still unique and charmingly modest structures. Think peach-coloured facades, thatched roofs, murals, and wooden beams and door frames, buildings that sit in subtle balance with the rugged landscape around them.
That was quite interesting because the foundation used nature-based materials as part of the conservation rather than, for example, cement, which sometimes we see used in the restoration.
Adobe is much more sustainable than materials like cement and steel, and it's crucial that the traditional construction methods survive in order for these buildings to have a chance. So much like the Machiya of Kyoto, the Fondazione Altiplano also relies on local traditional materials and craftsmen to restore the buildings. But they even go one step further, training locals in these methods.
This model, the way they did it, was rather inspirational. So it kind of inspired the whole regional strategy for the heritage preservation, the sustainable development. So it kind of upscaled. So although it started with a very small group of villages, then it became a model in a way for the entire region.
When people think about safeguarding architectural heritage, it's often the castles and beautiful churches that come to mind first, as we've already talked about. But the truth is, even industrial buildings, even the greyest and chunkiest of them, have something to give us, with the right kind of fixes, of course. Factories, old power stations, here's looking at Battersea, mills and dockyards possess unique characteristics. Think 30-metre shafts and ventilation towers, cooling lakes and gigantic atriums that can suit entirely new purposes. On top of that, large-scale adaptive reuse projects like these can even lead to the revival of entire neighbourhoods, attracting entrepreneurs, artists and visitors to otherwise neglected areas. This adaptive reuse not only benefits the neighbourhoods within the cities, but it also helps reduce unwanted urban sprawl, enriching what already exists while limiting the city's impact on the land surrounding it.
It is a kind of historical fact that lots of the places that have suffered economically because they had industries that collapsed have the best historic buildings, because they had wonderful buildings of that moment which have now been left high and dry by the changing tides of the economy.
That's Anna again.
And so whether that's seaside towns with amazing winter gardens, or whether it's former industrial towns with magnificent civic buildings, you've got the raw materials there for kind of rebirth. There's absolutely no doubt that historic buildings heritage is a huge untapped sort of cultural resource for regeneration.
Molten streams of high-grade gun steel poured from the furnaces as foundrymen strove to meet the endless demands for guns.
That's the Royal Arsenal. It's a complex of industrial buildings in Woolwich, an area in southeast London. Some of the buildings go back to as early as the 1600s. The arsenal is famous for the efforts of factory workers making artillery and weaponry. During the First World War, it employed up to 80,000 people. But the factory closed its doors in 1967, and in the decades that followed, the area experienced a decline. The buildings were set to be demolished until Historic England, an organisation sponsored by the British government to preserve historic buildings, intervened to protect the structures. Kalliopi has spent the past 10 years researching the neighbourhood and using it as a case study for the do's and don'ts of heritage-led regeneration.
So here we see an example where it is very much a development-led approach, but also with focus on the protection and the conservation of the buildings.
In the early 2000s, renovations started to convert many of the buildings into homes, hotels and cultural centres. Backed by the borough of Woolwich and private property companies, the regeneration of multiple factory buildings was an attempt to resuscitate the area.
This area is rather isolated, is separated from the rest of Woolwich, from the rest of the town centre. So there is a big road in between and a big wall. And this physical boundary has been an obstacle for bringing the two communities together. The new community who have been moving to the new development and have been inhabiting the new flats, and the elder community who has been living in Woolwich for many years. Now, with the newcomers coming mostly from a kind of middle class backgrounds, they're definitely higher incomes, and we can see that there is a widening in the social gap between the different communities, which has been experienced especially by the elder residents, and something that doesn't make them happy at all. The new development looks fundamentally different from what the rest of Woolwich is. It has a completely different picture. It looks rather staged, very pristine, and not vibrant.
It's often the case that a city changes right before your eyes in a matter of years. What's deemed as progress for one might lead to others feeling alienated. So it's worth remembering that it's not just about the buildings worth saving and the fresh faces that could attract, but about the existing community too.
Before planning on how old buildings can be reused, they should first understand very well what the needs, the social needs of that place are. By just adaptively reusing buildings mainly as restaurants or cafes or residential buildings, if this is not what the place really needs, it is very likely that when you have an external shock, like a major economic crisis or a pandemic, the whole program may collapse. So it is very fundamental to understand the social needs of the people and then co-create with them.
Kalliopi worked with the people of Woolwich in focus groups to find out exactly what it was that community members wanted from the reuse of the buildings, and found out firsthand where it was lacking. It's this essence of co-creating that she thinks makes for successful adaptive reuse.
So this is a space for everyone, not just for the residents of the Royal Arsenal, and the heritage is for everyone. So even if they have been reused as flats, it is still heritage. So this is access to history and heritage is for everyone. Therefore, it is important to involve people from the wider area and capture, if you like, their imagined future of how they would like to see that area evolving. We cannot expect developers necessarily to think about social cohesion or how the different communities connect with each other. They're very much about profit. So I think it is the role of the heritage professionals to have the social responsibility and think in advance beyond just the conservation of the buildings.
Kalliopi is keen to see buildings not just reused as homes, businesses and restaurants, but culture and art centres.
My second identity is that I'm a dancer and doing flamenco. In Woolwich, for example, there is a rather successful social enterprise called ArtFix. So the idea is that art is for everybody. And the way they operate that business is by having a cafe, like an art cafe. So they generate income through the coffee shop. But the art that is displayed, whether that is paintings or dancing or theater, whatever, it's free and it's accessible to everybody. We see that there is a cultural revival and there is a huge potential for culture and art to bring people together. The whole idea really is to be a platform for dialogue among the multicultural communities and groups who live in the area.
In 2021, the Woolwich Works opened its doors, an event space that has transformed 5 more of the factory buildings into a cultural centre. Today, it's become home to the world-famous theatre company Punchdrunk and was awarded as Best New Cultural Spot in London just a few months after opening. The centre hosts both commercial performances and community-focused events, a great example of the cultural revival Kalliopi's talking about. But at the end of the day, one of the most innate and downright simple reasons to restore and reuse rather than rebuild is sustainability.
Britain is in a race to build, with row upon row of cut-and-paste designs constructed by a handful of volume house builders.
Anonymous boxes, relentless. I think the sort of copybook that we see so often now.
That's a British TV news report from 2022. Under pressure from the housing crisis and shortages in affordable housing, property developers are churning out designs and buildings that think little about the communities they're serving and even less about the environmental impact they're having. Buildings generate almost 40% of annual global CO2 emissions, and the construction process is responsible for a large chunk of these emissions. When building a housing block, over 50% of its lifetime emissions are released during construction. Other emissions are down to what it takes to maintain and run the building once it's built. With this in mind, it's kind of a no-brainer that the most sustainable buildings are the ones that already exist.
The starting point is that the whole business of building conservation is fundamentally about the long term and about durability. I mean, the kind of embedded carbon in these buildings is enormous, and the kind of cultural predilection that's been so strong until and still now, really, for demolishing something perfectly good that was built really not that long ago to put something marginally different up. It's terrifying because we know that what that involves in terms of emissions and so on.
And the Trust takes it a step further, making sure their own properties are sustainable and energy efficient too, both in the way they're built and how they operate.
We're doing a project at the moment in Yorkshire, a building called Carverley Old Hall, and there the plan is to heat that building with a ground source heat pump that will obviously involve some electricity to run it, but which will be significantly therefore heated by renewable energy, which will be fantastic. And actually that goes right through to our interiors. I mean, our 200 existing buildings, and we'll carry on doing this, are overwhelmingly furnished with things that we bought that were already secondhand, whether tables, chairs, bed frames. There are a limited number of things which we get new.
The environmental benefits of adaptive reuse are being heard louder and louder. One initiative gaining momentum is the campaign Retro First, which was set up in 2019, led by the editor of the architect's journal, Will Hurst, and backed by over 200 architecture firms. Their aim is to pressure the British government to change tack in their policies towards reusing buildings. It's often a more costly and lengthy process to restore rather than building anew, and financially, there's a lack of incentive for property developers. So among the demands from the campaign are tax cuts and policy changes that will encourage property developers to reuse. Their sentiment is starting to gather momentum in the UK government, with politicians from across parties now calling for similar actions. Tax cuts have already been made on some refurbishment materials like insulation and heat pumps. It's a small step in the right direction. Once again, much like the Fundación Altiplano in Chile, the Preservationists of Japan and the Landmark Trust, it's grassroots organisation that often spark change and affect state decisions from bottom up rather than top down. So we've heard what works and what doesn't, but what's Toposophy's take on all this? What are the key lessons we can learn and apply to our own cities when it comes to reusing architectural heritage? Heritage restoration might sometimes seem like a niche pastime, But as we've heard, it actually has deep connections with a wide range of policy areas, including social cohesion and citizen engagement, as well as skills, entrepreneurship, and job creation. But here are a few things we should take note of. Firstly, planting the seeds of regeneration isn't an automatic process. It requires the various parties involved, heritage professionals, developers, property owners, and not least the local government, to have the vision and willingness to use restoration as a tool to bring about long-term regeneration to a particular area. Fortunately, inspiring projects such as those we've heard about in this episode can help to reassure different groups of stakeholders that they're doing the right thing. Take one of Toposophy's own projects. Right now, it's working on an exciting restoration right in the heart of the Greek capital, helping turn the iconic Arsakeio Building, a neoclassical wonder which once housed the first female-only boarding school, into Athens' first food hall. Inspired by examples from around the world and driven by the need to make this a transformative project for the local area in the long term, Toposophy is developing the concept framework and business plan for the new site. A second point to remember from today is the role of public authorities as an enabler. It's clearly very important because they're often the gatekeepers when it comes to developing buildings, or the type of areas we've been talking about. But how exactly can the public authorities help? By putting forward seed funding and providing an initial boost to get projects off the ground, as the Landmark Trust described with the investment in Inverness, by granting planning permission and adapting licensing rules, especially where a change of use in the property or a change of zoning regulation is needed. Monitoring and understanding the needs of the local community to ensure that new developments provide what local people need, or at least that their needs are met during development with the right public infrastructure, like places to socialise, schools and healthcare facilities. And, above all, being creative and being prepared to entrust local organisations and local people with decision-making.
The wonderful power of it is that these structures are everywhere. Where you take your dog for a walk, it's on your way to school, and it's about your place. It's a place where, your family, your grandparents, your forebears, literally or kind of imaginatively worked, and it's the buildings that they created. I hope that the sorts of projects we do also act as beacons for other people who might make them think about, well, maybe I could reuse that. But you need the money. It's all very well saying, as you walk through a town like, say, Boston in Lincolnshire, which is a wonderful historic town, and saying, well, you've got these fantastic historic buildings, surely it's, cultural regeneration can happen here. But if you sit there looking at them and they're falling down and people haven't got jobs, the sort of impetus and the injection and the catalyst for those places being revived is something that doesn't happen by chance. That only happens by determination from people, from local authorities, from governments.
The need to have the physicality of the space where all the social and cultural actions can take place is really essential. So I think this is something that has a lot of huge potential. Use the architectural heritage as just the beginning of unpacking all the other layers, the intangible layers associated with the heritage, and inspire new ways of living which are sustainable, socially, environmentally, and financially as well.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Common Ground by Toposophy. It was developed and produced by the Greek Podcast Project with production assistance from Gaia Lutz. It was curated by the team at Toposophy. On our next episode,
we're understanding all the existing vulnerabilities and those that are to come, and thinking about how do we create projects that have a purpose, not only on the wettest days where there's a climate disaster, but every single day can enhance the community that it's in.
We're heading to New York to hear how a design competition is bringing together architects and communities to build resilience into the city's urban fabric. We also hear from the mayor of San Jose about a new community task force that's tackling the climate crisis in California. And we head to Australia, where scientists are using the data of the past bushfires to better prepare for future hazards. Subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts so you don't miss an episode. If you like this episode, please leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts, because it really helps more people find us. I'm Daphne Karnezis. Thanks for listening.